Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We have another great guest for you this week. We're talking to paranormal researcher, author, and lecturer Chad Lewis. Chad has authored many books on the paranormal, including his Road Guide to Mysterious Creatures series, Road Guide to Haunted Location series, and his most recent title, Wendigo Lore, Monsters, Myths, and Madness. Welcome to the show, Chad. Thank you for joining us today.
Greetings from the Northwoods of Wisconsin.
Yeah, you're up in the Midwest there.
Yes, I'm up here in the Northwoods of Winterville.
So you have been a paranormal researcher and an author for many, many years, but you started out by getting your master's in psychology. So how did you roll that into the paranormal, going from having a master's in psychology to the paranormal?
Well, I always blame my interest in the strange and unusual on my home state of Wisconsin, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have three of them. Three different cities all claim to be the UFO capital of the entire world here in our state. And when I was in high school, I happened to grow up near one of those capitals, and I was interested in why people were seeing UFOs. So I traveled to the town and interviewed people, and just happened that I was going to college the next fall studying psychology. And I was really interested in why some people believe in the paranormal and others do not. You know, what was it about human perception and belief systems? And that really spawned me into from UFOs to ghosts, cryptids, crop circles, and the whole spectrum.
Yeah, and like I said, you've written many, many books. You've got a few different series that you've done. A lot of your stuff does center around the Midwest, which is kind of cool. I haven't talked to a whole lot of people from the Midwest and talked about folklore and stuff up there. So you mentioned UFOs is kind of what got you into it. And you've extensively researched UFOs of Wisconsin. What are some of those stories and what's some of the weirder stuff that you heard about UFOs?
Well, there's a good reason we have so many UFO capitals of the world here, because we have just so many bizarre stories of things that are happening that are just beyond belief. One of my favorite stories of UFOs, no matter whether it's around the world or in the U.S. here, is the story of a gentleman named Joe Simonton. And this happened back in 1961 in northern Wisconsin, where he was having a late lunch, early brunch, and he sees this UFO land in his yard. And since he had never really given UFOs much thought, he wasn't terrified. He was curious. So he walks out there, and this thing hovering, which was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, was hovering in his yard. He walks out, and up pops a opening on this thing like the trunk of your car. And you can see several beings inside, humans or aliens or inhabitants, whatever they were. And they were all very small with, he said, dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes. They reminded him of tiny Italian men. And they were all dressed identical, and they needed water, apparently. They had a jug, and they motioned like water. So he went and filled up their jug with water, and he came back and handed it to him, and he saw one of them seemed to be cooking something over a flameless type grill. So he motioned with his hand, like, "Are you eating?" Trying to get some communication going. And the leader goes over and hands Simonton these three, what people were calling UFO pancakes, and traded him for the water. And so then the spaceship just took off, left after he made that trade. And Simonton ate one of the pancakes, said it was the worst tasting pancake he'd ever had. And what I love about that case, besides how just bizarre it is, now, every year I get dozens and dozens of people reporting UFOs. And it's always very similar. It's a ball of light or maybe a weird craft. But I love the Simonton case because here you have alien pancakes being traded. And the fact that it got so much attention that the Air Force came and investigated it. Project Blue Book, Dr. J. Allen Hynek and two of his assistants came up and interviewed Simonton and took some of the pancake to have it analyzed. And it's just truly bizarre. You just don't get cases like that anymore.
Yeah, that is pretty weird.
You know, and then Simonton, until the day he died, he believed he had encountered something not of this world. And in the first week after his story broke, over 1,000 people showed up at his farm looking for those alien pancakes.
Right. And that guy probably had nothing to gain by reporting that or having this crazy story.
He actually lost income. He was a farmer, but also a plumber. And he lost a lot of jobs because people didn't want him working. They thought he was crazy.
Right.
They thought he was a lunatic. You know, and a lot of these stories of paranormal phenomena, especially in the old days, when they listed the witnesses in the newspaper account, these people had a lot of personal reputation to lose. That there's a case down in Van Meter, Iowa in 1903 where this giant bat-like creature was said to attack the tiny town for 5 nights. And on one night, the bank manager loaded up his shotgun, went down to the bank to protect the town's money against what he thought were bank robbers. And he ends up shooting at this giant bird-like creature, shoots out the front window of his bank. Now, in 1903, I mean, I don't know, a lot of people would think, I want to put my money in a bank where the manager's shooting the windows out at a giant bird-like monster.
Right.
You know, I don't know if they would, I certainly wouldn't want to back then. So a lot of these people risk their reputation and livelihood by coming forward with their accounts.
So you said that the 3 of the most active UFO areas in the United States is in Wisconsin. What is it? Just a sheer number of stories and sightings, or what do you attest that to?
Yes, well, they're all self-proclaimed, of course, like every capital of the world. But I think it's not only the weirdness of them, but just the duration. That there's another town that I grew up near, Elmwood, Wisconsin, which is one of those capitals, and decade after decade, they just had sighting after sighting after sighting. And one of the more infamous was their police officer, George Wheeler. And when we think of credible witnesses, we think of those trained observers, firefighters, police officers, pilots, you know, men and women that have been trained to observe. So when he was called out to the quarry thinking there was a fire there, and it turned out to be a UFO that shot a beam of light down and hit his car, and he awoke many minutes later, slumped over his steering wheel, unconscious by a passerby. You know, those type of stories seem to have a lot of credibility to them because they're in such credible witnesses. So, yes, not only the weirdness of these accounts, but also how long they've been going on.
Yeah, and you were talking about the Van Meter visitor, and that kind of sounds like the Mothman, the famous Mothman in Ohio, and with the bridge collapse and all that stuff. Do you think that possibly those are the same creature, or was it described as the same creature, or was it different?
It was very similar looking, and a lot of people have made that connection. And we, in a book we did on it, we put a chapter in of possible other creatures that were similar. And this visitor creature was thought to be about 8 feet tall, had giant leather bat-like wings, but it had a horn on its head, and apparently it could project light out of that horn. So right away you're thinking, what kind of flesh and blood creature could this have been in 1903? Was it a misidentified, condor, whatever it was? But it also had supernatural abilities where for 5 nights the townsfolk shot it with everything they had. And whether these people were the worst shots in Iowa or the thing was impervious to their weapons, it didn't even bother it. It was also said to be able to release some odor into the air that would take your memory away for the rest of the night.
Wow.
Much like we see in the abduction lore with alien abduction stuff, taking missing time, missing memories. So it differed a little bit from the Mothman in that regard, but the general terms of it being a giant bat-like creature seems to be very similar.
And with the Mothman, there's a lot of UFO alien type stories around that too, with weird visitors, and there's a story of some people coming into contact at the same time. Is there any stories like that around the Van Meter visitor?
Not that we know of. Unfortunately, all we have were the old newspaper accounts of that time. And we thought maybe once the book came out, we would find someone who had Grandpa's journal in their attic or something like that. But because if this stuff was going on for 5 nights in the town, you would think someone would have wrote about it or documented it, especially if the most prominent people in town, the bank manager, the mayor, the superintendent of schools, the postmaster,
Right.
that somebody would have had it. But as far as we know, none of that happened. It started with the UFO sighting. An implement dealer was coming home late at night and he saw a ball of light hovering over a building. And he slowed down thinking it was a intruder or a prankster or a bank robber. And then the ball of light vanished, reappeared on the other side of the street on top of another building, and then disappeared. And some say it flew across the street. But so it started as a UFO encounter, and then it did leave behind giant three-toed tracks in the mud. But outside of that, there's no physical evidence that it was ever there. I mean, people took deliberate aim and shot it. They were convinced they had hit it, and they were looking for any blood or fur or dead hoaxer, anything of that nature, but nothing was ever there.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting story. And like you had said, you had co-wrote a book called The Van Meter Visitor, where you did all the stories in there.
Yeah, and that was one out of all the books I've done. That one was probably covering a lot more theory than any of the others. Speculation as to what it could be and what it wasn't, and really got in depth with all these different possibilities because it was so weird and it was unlike anything I had ever encountered before. That, like I said, these weird cases really appeal to me. These cases that stand out from, yes, I love general Bigfoot stories or hauntings or UFOs, but the ones that stand out as being truly bizarre, that's what appeals to me the most.
Yeah, and like I said in the intro, you've done a whole series of the Road Guide to Mysterious Creatures for various states in the Midwest and other cryptid stuff too. That whole area, the whole Midwest, especially around the Great Lakes, seems to be kind of full of cryptids and weird creatures.
It is, and I think it's partly because we have so many different environments here, from southern Illinois, which is pretty much swampy southland, all the way up to northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, which borders Canada, of course, and you get the Arctic seeming winters up there. We also have a lot of lakes. We have nearly 15,000 lakes here in Wisconsin alone, so we get reports of sea serpents and lake monsters, and there's just a lot of wooded area. There's a lot of farming. So there's a lot of habitat if these things are actually flesh and blood and roaming.
What's some of the kind of regional creatures that you've come across in writing these books?
Well, I think one of the more infamous from the Midwest would be the Beast of Bray Road. And that's a werewolf-type creature that was first reported traveling down this small stretch of road called Bray Road. And people would see, for a lack of a better term, a giant werewolf. You know, the long muzzle, the deep, dark, matted down fur, the claws, the fangs. And these people would be terrified that this creature seemed to be some sort of biped running upright on its hind legs. And my good friend and colleague, Linda Godfrey, first wrote about it. And since she did, people from all over the U.S. have been contacting us about werewolf sightings throughout not only the Midwest, but the entire United States. And now it's kind of spread into the Michigan Dogman and many others. So I think that's one of the more infamous ones. There's also a sea serpent on the Mississippi River. There's a lake on the river, and it divides Wisconsin and Minnesota. And there's a creature that has been seen for hundreds of years that they've dubbed Peppy, the lake monster of Lake Pepin. And my favorite part about this story is that there's a $50,000 reward being offered for the capture of this sea serpent. And as of today, nobody has captured it and claimed that prize, but there is a $50,000 reward being offered for anyone who can capture Peppy, which is a unique thing in its own right. That's something P.T. Barnum used to do, offered $10,000 for anyone who could capture Lake Champlain's champ monster. Of course, nobody did, but you know, so those kind of things are pretty fun. I like that. And it was obviously the gentleman who did it as a marketing ploy, but also because he wanted people to come to the lake. And he said, if you come to the lake and you don't see Peppy, the worst thing that will happen is you'll have a great day at the lake.
So with Peppy, most people are familiar with Loch Ness Monster and kind of the look of it. Is Peppy similar to that, or does it have differing features?
Well, the odd thing is that Peppy comes mainly in two different categories of sightings. The first would be what you would think of the Loch Ness Monster, the long neck and the hump. But the second seems to be more snake-like or eel-like. Your giant 30 feet long, possibly the dimensions, the thickness of a man's leg that's been seen dark color, either dark green, brown, or even black. So there seems to be, I don't know if people are seeing two different creatures or the same creature at different angles, or how the human mind works. Maybe people are seeing the same thing, but seeing it differently.
Yeah.
And you get that quite a bit in paranormal reports, that people can be in the same car looking at the same, whether it's a UFO or creature, but they have different interpretations of what that looks like. And I've had people describe, when it comes to ghosts, some people saying that it was a spirit of a loved one, where others who are a bit more religious will say that it was a guardian angel or a demon coming to visit them. So that makes a big difference on what you're seeing as well. You would think if something appears, everybody who sees it's going to think and feel the same thing, but it just doesn't happen that way.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how your beliefs and your experiences in life kind of set you up to have a different experience, even though you're having the same experience at the same time as somebody else. That's pretty interesting.
And I think skeptics really jump on that when you have, let's say, three witnesses in a car seeing a monster, and they're giving you different interpretations of it, that skeptics say, well, obviously they're making it up, or they can't even agree on what this thing looked like. But they don't realize that that happens all the time in courts across the world, where people, eyewitnesses, give different accounts. And I think we all experience that based on where you are and your beliefs and even your age, that we've all been to places years ago and you thought, this place is amazing. This town is fantastic. I love it here. And then maybe 10, 15 years later, when you're a completely different person, you go back and think, is this the same place? So perception, I think, plays into differences in the paranormal quite a bit.
And all the phenomena that you've researched and you've interviewed people, I mean, most of these people don't have anything to gain. If anything, they have, like we were talking about the one guy, Pancake alien story, he had nothing to gain. He actually lost stuff. And so most of the people are just normal people, and they're just reporting, what they experienced.
The overwhelming majority of people I've interviewed are rational, down-to-earth, logical, intelligent people who might not even be interested in the paranormal. So many people come up to me and say, now, I don't believe in ghosts, but this is what happened to me.
Yeah.
So, yes, they're not out there looking to get on television. They're not looking to write a book. They're not looking to get famous. If anything, they'd rather keep their story under wraps. That many people have told me, I don't even want you to investigate this. I just want to tell someone, because I don't want to die with this story, never being told.
Yeah, and actually talk to somebody who believes them, who's not going to just laugh at them or just brush them off.
I think luckily over the last 20 years or so, thanks to a lot of the TV shows and Hollywood, that people feel a little more comfortable coming forward with their stories. When I first started out, people would come up to me and kind of look around and make sure no one was watching, and then they would whisper the story that they encountered. But now, after I do a lecture, people will raise their hands and tell you the complete details of their experience. And others in the audience will say, yeah, I've had something like that similar happen to me. So I think that's been a positive change over the last few decades.
Yeah, I believe that is too. And I think, like you were saying, the prevalence of all the shows on TV have definitely helped with people come to the forefront instead of kind of being on the fringes. And also the proliferation of like podcasts like I do and all that stuff definitely helps. And that's one reason why I like to talk about it, because maybe somebody I know who wouldn't necessarily listen to a podcast or do any, get into the paranormal, maybe if they listen to my show, they feel, not alone or less crazy because I'm sitting here talking about all this different stuff and maybe some of the stuff they've actually experienced themselves.
I think so. I think it's going to only increase that. More and more people will come out with their stories, and not just things that happen to them currently, but things that happened to them in the past, or maybe a family story where grandpa used to always spin yarns about the encounter he had, So I think we're just tapping the surface of the folklore, which is out there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have authors like you and researchers like you who will go out and collect these stories because, like you're saying, with like the family stories and the family folklore, if we don't have people like you, then those stories might be lost to history. It might lend credence, even more credence, to a phenomenon that other people are recounting.
When I first started out researching this, like a lot of people at that time, I thought I was going to get into the field, grab some cases, solve a bunch of them, discover all this new information, and figure out what was going on. And for me, anyway, and some of my colleagues, I learned early on that that's a good way to burn yourself out. But if you're just trying to find answers and solve these things, you're probably going to spin your wheels quite a bit. So for me, early on, I took the approach of almost a folklorist, that I'm going to collect these stories, interview witnesses, try to figure out what's going on, but also enjoy the adventure of it. Traveling the back roads, digging up these legends, talking to witnesses, and whether or not I solved the case, for me, yeah, it would be great, but it's certainly not a discouragement when it doesn't happen.
There's so much in this world that we don't know about the human body, about the world in general, and even physicists, keep expanding their definitions of what our world is, as far as like multidimensions and that type of stuff. They've come out and said now, whereas 50 years ago they would have been laughed out of their field. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's just interesting that you have some people who are willing to be definite and say, "Oh, I know this is not true." Well, you don't know.
Well, I feel after 25 years in this field, I'm left with more questions than answers. And I often encounter people who say that a red orb means this thing, or a blue orb means it's angry, or vice versa, or that, their spirit guides are telling them what these things mean, and there's portals here. And that's great when you have that belief or theory or speculation, but I think far too often people portray it as the only truth.
Yeah.
That this is the answer, when in actuality, I don't think we have any answers in this field. If we did, nobody would be wondering whether a place is haunted or not, or if we're alone in the universe. And until that time comes, if it ever does, I think it's a disservice to say my answer is the only answer.
Yeah. And I when I'm talking to fans and people that are in the paranormal, always try to make them understand that, there's no such thing as an expert in the paranormal field, because you can't prove any of it. So you can't be an expert on something that you can't prove.
Right. Yeah. You can be an expert on the story of a legend.
Right.
For the Van Meter, I'd consider myself an expert on the details of what was encountered or what was reported. But in terms of an expert on as to what it was, my guess is probably as good or not as more important than anyone else's, that I have zero idea. So I think you can be an expert on some of the legends and lore, but experts on the explanation, if you will, is, for me anyway, I would never consider myself that.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I'm just saying, like, you have people out there like, paranormal investigators and stuff on TV who consider themselves paranormal experts of the paranormal in general. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. How can you be an expert, as you just said, on something we have no idea whether it exists?
So let's move on to your newest book that just came out last year, Wendigo Lore. Wendigo is always something that's always fascinated me. And people don't know what a Wendigo is. It's a creature or evil spirit from folklore, and it originated with Algonquin tribes up around the Great Lakes of Canada and the United States.
Yes, and I think the irony of the Wendigo lore is that it's the most feared creature that we have in North America for legend. It's also perhaps the oldest folklore legend of a monster that we have, but yet it's one of the most unknown. As you said, most people have never heard of it, or they don't understand it. And the Windigo was so terrifying to many cultures in Canada and in the northern portion of the U.S. around the Great Lakes, and to the eastern edge of the U.S. as well. But it was so deadly and terrifying that we have cases where people starved to death because they, rather than go out of their dwelling to hunt for food and game, they had heard of Windigos just in the area. So instead of trying to go out, they simply starved to death. That they thought it would be better to starve than to even try to get out and to go look for food when the Windigo was just rumored to be in the area.
That's crazy that, yeah, they'd be so afraid of it. And it comes from many, many different tribes. There's many translations, but it's all around the kind of the same. Wendigo is kind of the blanket term that's been adopted from all these different tribes from different areas of the country as well.
Yeah, they called it many different names and many different spellings, but the creature, when it was in flesh and blood, was always very tall, very skeletal looking, very emaciated. It could be somewhere between 8 and however tall it wanted to get. Some reports said it was bigger than the biggest trees if it wanted. And it always seemed to be hell-bent on consuming human flesh, that some accounts report that it's even missing its own lips and mouth because its insatiable hunt for human flesh, it devoured its own body. But more terrifying to me, rather than just seeing one of those creatures, is that it was thought to also be in spirit form, where it could possess you and slowly turn you into a Windigo. And we have many cases where people killed one another, believing that that person was turning into a Windigo, and that if they wouldn't have killed that person, that Windigo would have infected the entire town, the community, the tribe, and they'd all be dead. So they thought they had to do it. It was their duty to kill that person. And these aren't, stories of vampires attacking somebody in the woods where you have no documentation. These were cases where many instances, the killer, the Windigo hunter, would be put on trial for killing somebody that the white law enforcement officers deemed was a murder.
Wow.
They didn't see it as hunting Windigo. They saw it as you're murdering somebody. Yeah. So we have these documented cases of this actually happening hundreds and hundreds of times.
So is there still reports of the Windigo?
There certainly are. They differ quite a bit from the early lore of the legend, and they differ a bit in geography as well. That I just received a report not too long ago from South Dakota, the Badlands, Black Hills area, which is not traditionally thought of as Windigo territory. And this was, in modern times. But if you look at the Windigo, if you Google Windigo on your computer, you'll see the newest version of it seems to be more almost elk-like. It'll often have antlers. It'll be thin and sometimes even an elk head-looking thing, where the old lore of it was this tall, thin, gaunt, skeletal-looking monster that was just hideous beyond form. Where today, I think some of the more recent reports have it having antlers or horns on it as well. And, these things change over hundreds of years. And that happens with, I think, a lot of different folklore, that these stories never really just are stagnant. They're always morphing and progressing as each new generation puts their spin on it.
Yeah, and I've heard some really terrifying stories that people thought they were being stalked in the woods by Windigo. Interesting folklore.
It is,
and the fear, like you said, that it strikes into people and has for hundreds of years.
I think that's what separates it from a lot of other stories, where sometimes people who see Bigfoot will be terrified, but most of the time it's more of a sense of wonder and awe that they get when seeing these things, where the Windigo is the exact opposite. It really instilled fear in people that was, as I said, you'd rather die than to turn Windigo. And many of the people that felt that they were turning Windigo, they begged to be killed so they wouldn't turn into this creature and devour their friends and family. So I think the Windigo is just terrifying in so many ways that it was inescapable. But yet there's contrary evidence or contradicting evidence of, some say it couldn't be killed no matter what because it was this elemental force. But then there are other tales that if you pour hot tallow down its throat, it will defrost its icy heart and it will die, or you can cut the heart out of it or decapitate it or burn it. So we have all this conflicting evidence throughout the folklore that makes it even more confusing to people.
And one of the things I find fascinating with folklore like the Windigo is that you have all these different Native American tribes in Canada and the United States who have the similar story, the similar pronunciation of the name. And some of these cultures never cross paths with each other. So for them to have the same type creatures, same type stories, I think lends more credence to the stories and the folklore of it actually being something real, possibly.
Yeah, when you're looking at tribes being in the eastern portion of the U.S., Northeast, having similar creatures and legends as tribes out in the far western province of Alberta, Canada, they never crossed paths. And even the missionaries that were there, the French explorers and a lot of the other pioneers, they didn't cross paths either. And I find it fascinating that we can see a lot of European influence coming into the Windigo story. There are legends dating to the 1800s about how the Windigo could only be killed with a silver bullet, which is obviously the Europeans' werewolf legends that they brought over with them and incorporated it. Because although it was and always will be a First Nations legend, there were many other cultures there throughout the hundreds of years that put, their 2 cents in.
Yeah, and there's other legends too, like Bigfoot is one of those that's kind of pervasive across all the different Native American cultures and kind of all around the world. And with that, it's not just North America that has the Bigfoot. You have the abominable snowman, the Yeti, halfway around the world, and these people never cross paths for sure.
And it makes you wonder, as you said, so many of these different cultures and different peoples that are not connected, not related, are experiencing the same thing. Why is that? Yeah, very interesting, very puzzling in my opinion.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of this raises more questions than answers for sure.
Yeah, and then when you start to think of some of these sightings being with other similar sightings, or these places that seem to be a paranormal beacon, or what John Keel called window areas, where you might have Bigfoot sightings, but also haunted legends or sea serpents and UFO reports, that these hot spots where just something odd about them. And I think a lot of people in this field tend to specialize quite a bit, that they only want to do Bigfoot research or UFOs, and they have no interest or no time for anything else that interferes with that. And I think I'm quite the opposite, where I'm fascinated when there people are seeing several different phenomena at the same time. And I realize a lot of researchers will say, don't try to explain one weird event with another weird event. But for me, it's not so much explaining, it's just looking into why are people seeing a UFO and then a sea serpent pops up.
Right.
Are they connected? Is it something completely different, coincidental, hallucination? I don't know.
Well, and a big popular phenomenon in the paranormal world right now is the missing 411 stuff. And a lot of those clusters that have been mapped by David Paulides center around some of these same areas like you're talking about, where all of this paranormal phenomena is reported and experienced. And then you have these weird disappearances that are kind of a tangible evidence that maybe something really is weird going on in these certain particular places for whatever reason, ley lines or whatever theory that you prescribe to.
Here in the Midwest, many people are familiar with the Smiley face killer theory.
Yeah.
That we have so many young, usually college-age men drowning in rivers that there started a legend that it was some sort of smiley face killer or killers that were luring these men to their death. And then others came out and said, no, it seems to be some sort of spirit or siren of the water enticing these men into their watery graves. And then, of course, law enforcement and other researchers who have dug deep into it say it's nothing more than alcohol related, that we have a lot of lakes, we have a lot of rivers, and we have a lot of drinking in the Midwest. And now that combination is going to lead to a lot of drowning. Yeah,
and like with the smiley face killer stuff, there's too many coincidences, I think, in a lot of it for it not to be something weird going on there. The way that the people disappear, the way they drown, where they're found, their bodies are in perfect shape, and they're found months later. It's a lot of weird stuff around that. But that also is happening in areas where you have other paranormal reports as well.
Well, I remember a case where a gentleman was out drinking with his buddies. He got separated, but he was on a strip, of bars. Every college has those couple blocks of bars that the kids congregate on. And I remember the story was that he came out of the bar, called his buddies and said, "Where are you?" And they said, "We're at this bar." So he looks down the street, he sees them, waves to them, said, "I'm coming to you. Wait for me." And then he ends up, dead a couple miles in the opposite direction in a river or a lake. And it makes you wonder, well, in that kind of case, that seems so improbable that he would just turn around from seeing his friends and walk off.
Yeah, and on some of the video, I think the reason that some people are subscribing that it's paranormal, supernatural type stuff, because there's video cameras everywhere now, and on some of they've seen some of the guys on some of the videos, and then they don't see them like leaving the club or they just disappear from the video. They go out of frame and then they're just never seen again. They're not seen on the next video camera that should have captured them.
And I think a bigger question or bigger concept is the fact that with all this paranormal phenomena, as it's happening, we have, as you mentioned, more video than we've ever had. Surveillance cameras, trail cameras, game cameras. People have cameras on their doorbells now.
Yeah.
That why have we not seen more paranormal evidence? That you would think we were filming everything. Why isn't it being recorded? But in the same exact notion is that unless you film something yourself, you're probably not going to believe anybody else's film.
Right.
You could have a UFO land in your backyard, film it, put it on the internet, and in a matter of minutes have 100 people telling you how fake it looks.
Yeah, because it's so easy to fake now with computers, and anybody at home can make these videos.
And I don't think a lot of people in the general public realize how fleeting these sightings usually are. That when someone has a sighting of something weird, it's not where it sits there for an hour and they taking notes and they can get photos and videos and really analyze this stuff. It's usually happens so fast that before a person even thinks, I should get out my camera and film this.
Right.
It's already gone. Their mind's just trying to wrap around what's happening. And by the time they get their senses, the thing's already done.
Yeah, and that's like paranormal investigating. You get some of the best stuff happens when your batteries are dead, you're changing batteries, or you're not recording for some reason. It just seems to happen when that happens. Like there's some sense in the paranormal world that they know when to do stuff and when not to.
I agree. And I've always wanted to do an experiment when I'm out with some researchers is to have a Frisbee or a football or something and just out of the blue, just throw it and see how many people were able to get out their camera, put in their passcode, get to their, get out their phone, put it in, get to their camera and film it, being caught off guard like that. And most likely, unless you're filming as you're walking or setting up cameras, you wouldn't have captured it.
Yeah, and like you hear with a lot of UFO videos and sightings, some of those have lasted, 5-10 minutes or more, and that's why the people have been able to get out a video camera or whatever. But they also report that, it was going on, 5 minutes before I was able to record it. Yeah,
and you have those where sometimes these things happen night after night, where people after the first night or even two, they'll figure we better just have our cameras at the ready. And that will happen. But for a lot of people that I talk to, it just seems to be no rhyme or rhythm or reason for why it's happening. It just seems to be as sporadic as anything.
So there's kind of a divide in the paranormal world between different researchers. We've talked about, different creatures and Bigfoot and, all this different stuff. And with Wisconsin having the UFO capitals, what do you think? Do you think a lot of this centers around UFOs, or you just think it's some kind of other phenomena?
For the International UFO Congress this year, I did a program on cryptids and UFOs, of how a lot of times UFOs have been spotted either before, during, or after cryptids have been seen. And again, we have to remember that, correlation is not causation, that just because they happen at the same time doesn't mean they're the same thing. But I'm amazed that so many of these things seem to happen together. And like everything else in this field, I'm open-minded, where I'm not convinced one way or the other whether these things are flesh and blood or that they're supernatural in nature, because so many things don't make sense. On the one hand, with a lot of these stories, you have things that no flesh and blood creature can do. Release odors to erase your memory, or to avoid bullets, or to simply vanish into thin air. But on the flip side, we have people who find what appear to be footprints, hair, other what seem to be physical evidence that something was here in the way we would think a bear or a lion is here.
Right.
So I don't know. I go back and forth, and I think sometimes if you jump into one camp full-hearted, much like with orbs and hauntings and that you might be blinding yourself, even unintentionally, to some of the evidence on the other side. So I try to look at each case on its own merit and try not to, put my camp down in one tent or the other.
And here lately, I've heard from a lot of paranormal investigators and some psychics that I talked to, and they've all talked about the thinning of the veil. Do you think that's occurring, and that's why we're having more paranormal experiences and reports, or do you think it's because of the popular culture and ghost and paranormal and that stuff?
Well, I think it's both, if that makes sense. I've had for decades psychics telling me that the world was ready for a new revolution, if you will, a new age revolution, that we were all being prepared to take that next step in our psychic ability and the next step in human evolution. And they've been telling me that for decades. And maybe that's happening. Maybe the veil that forever cultures have thought that there's certain nights of the year, whether it's All Hallows Eve or the winter solstice, when these worlds were at their closest, the veil was the thinnest. And that could be happening. And I think it probably is. But on the same hand, I think more and more people are getting involved in this, and they're getting interested in it. And that's shooting up a lot of the sightings too, that people, not only do regular general public people feel more comfortable coming forward with their stories, there are now more people collecting those stories, where it could have been 100 years ago, people had just as many, if not more, stories and experiences than we have. It was just nobody was there collecting them and saving them.
Right.
With the Windigo, back to the Windigo, I think so much of that lore has been lost forever, because the little bit that we do know from the early days just happened to be whether there was somebody there who could write, and whether they had paper and whether, or something to write on, and whether or not they were too busy trying not to starve to write these down. So I think a lot of the legend and folklore from old original stuff has just been lost to history. It was passed orally, and a lot of those traditions have been forgotten.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, that's why I think it's so important to have researchers and authors like you out there writing down this folklore and collate them somewhere, so that they do go on to more generations, so that if one of those generations dies out, those stories don't die with them.
And I think podcasts like yours and others are really starting to be the newspapers of the old. And what I mean by that is, today, if we want to know about stories that may have happened in the early 1900s, late 1800s, or through, before our lifetimes, we depend mostly on newspaper accounts.
Right.
They documented them. 50 years from now, people might be coming back to explore these podcasts to see what legends we were believing in. So even though the format might change, they're still being recorded.
Yeah. So with the government starting to disclose some of its UFO knowledge, and then they come up with this thing, previous stimulus bill that they had 180 days to disclose it to the public. Do you think anything's going to come out of that with UFOs, and we're going to get any answers, or do you think it's just going to leave more questions than answers?
I think a lot's going to come out, more than we'd ever want, and it will leave us more confused than ever. I think a lot of governments have found that it's much easier to flood information than it is to contain it. That when you try to censor everything, that's a lot of work, and it never fully works. Whereas if you just flood so much out there that people have no idea what is accurate and what is not, what is reliable, what is not, you're doing the same thing. It's just easier. The truth is in there somewhere. And I think we've seen that. I mean, how many different explanations for Roswell have the government has it released, and to the point where most people, when asked about Roswell, they'll say, I have no idea. There's just too much out there. It's just, unless you're really interested, like we are, you're not going to have you're just going to have a passing interest in it. And much like the Patterson film and the Loch Ness Monster, I think most people just are convinced one way or the other, but for the most part, they're confused.
Yeah, and there was just a document dump. The guy has a podcast, and he just got like 3 of his FOIA, his Freedom of Information Act, through the CIA, and I think they dumped like 18,000 documents on him. So to even wade through 18,000 documents is insane.
And I'm certainly not the first investigator or researcher in this field to make this point, but I don't know about you, but all my social media are flooded with case after case of people posting. And a lot of now sites on the internet are these warehouses that collect stories and then just put them out. But it's always just a headline or a paragraph or two.
Right.
And they happen so many times a day that it becomes white noise.
Yeah.
That, in any given day, I can get 10 reports in my feeds that are all about some giant bird-like creature, and they're never followed up. They're never investigated. Again, it just becomes a scrolling bait almost.
Yeah, and also the way that, the social media works, they choose what you see and what you don't. So out of all of those, 10 a day that you see, how many are you not seeing? Yeah,
and you're seeing different ones than I am.
Right.
Yeah, it's a confusing world. And again, I think so many people, even inadvertently, I had a woman come up to me after a program and showed me her phone, and she thought she had a ghost in a photo next to her. And I said, well, go home, email it to me so I can take a better look at it on the computer. And after the program, when I got home, she had emailed me and said, I'm very sorry. I didn't know this, but my daughter installed a ghost app on my phone. So when I took photos, it would insert a ghost into my photo. I had no idea, sorry. So sometimes you don't even know when you're being tricked.
Right. And that goes back to what we were talking about. It's so easy to fake stuff. And she wasn't trying to fake anything. She just inadvertently, her daughter put that on her phone, and it looked like a ghost to her in the picture. Cause she, being from an older generation, probably doesn't really have any knowledge of there's anything like that exist.
Exactly. And every book that I've ever done on any creature of any notoriety, I've had people come forward and say, I'm the reason that it started. I hoaxed it. I started the origin of the legend. And oftentimes multiple people will come forward claiming that they started the same legend. And they don't realize that sometimes you have newspaper accounts going back 100 years of people encountering it, where they might have hoaxed it and propelled the legend, but they certainly didn't start it. And I always chuckle when people tell me I started this legend. And as I said, oftentimes it's multiple different people all claiming throughout different decades that they were the origin of the legend.
If somebody come forward like that, that would make me want to question their motives for wanting to come out front and say, well, I started this,
Yeah, exactly. I don't know whether it's to get it off their chest or to put confusion or to discredit some of these legends, because many people not only see this as just a harmless research field for people, some see it as damaging, that they're completely against any legends of this sort.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to where you live in the country. Like, I live in the Bible Belt, and so you get a lot of religious people who they don't want to hear about ghosts. They don't believe in ghosts. They don't believe in any of this phenomena. Like, and if you're a part of the paranormal world, then you are either possessed or damned or you're a heathen.
And I've had some tourist shops down in the South contact me saying, we can sell Bigfoot type books, but we can't sell UFO or alien type books here.
Wow.
That, Bigfoot seems to be okay because it might be one of God's creations, might be this undiscovered or unknown animal or some creature that was thought to be extinct and has now been discovered. But that's well and good. But like ghosts and UFOs and the rest, can't talk about that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I was amazed.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I've grown up here in the Bible Belt, and maybe they're in an area that if they had those type books, some people wouldn't even come in their store.
Yeah, I would love to see an Amazon review of how they always do the most searched words in each region of but what type of paranormal phenomena books sell the best in each region, whether it's ghosts, cryptids, or something else. That would be a fascinating study, I think.
Yeah. Well, Chad, I thank you for coming on today. Everybody can go to your website, chadlewisresearch.com, and find all of your books on there, or, of course, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, those places as well. And they can find you at Backroads Lore on Facebook and Twitter. Do you have anything coming up? I know this book just came out last summer, the Wendigo Lore book. Do you have anything upcoming?
I have a ton of projects. And again, if you're looking to contact me, I'd love to hear stories, or if you want to find my work, or just head to the place you think is the weirdest place you've ever been, and most likely you'll find me there.
All right. Well, I thank you so much for coming on today. Had a great chat. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and keep an eye out.
For sure. Will do. All right, everybody. Thanks once again for listening. And as always, stay safe out there. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.